Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The road leading to the campsite was little more than a dirt trail, winding endlessly through towering trees that blotted out most of the sunlight. My car kicked up dust as I finally reached the clearing, a flat expanse of grass nestled against a crystal-clear lake. The stillness of the air struck me immediately. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I stepped out of the car, stretching after the long drive, and surveyed the area. It was perfect. The lake shimmered under the mid-morning sun, its surface like glass reflecting the surrounding forest. The scent of pine filled my lungs as I unpacked my gear. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a solo escape from the chaos of daily life. Just me, the wilderness, and the silence. Setting up camp took less than an hour. My tent stood sturdy under the shade of a massive oak, and I arranged my folding chair by the lake's edge, a book and a thermos of coffee within arm's reach. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area, sticking to well-marked trails and marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. By evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I lit a small campfire and cooked a simple meal. The crackling flames and the whisper of the breeze created a soothing backdrop as I ate, staring into the darkening woods. A pang of unease crept in as shadows lengthened, but I brushed it aside. Solitude had its challenges, but I had come here for this: peace, quiet, and a chance to clear my head. As the night deepened, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the tent's zipper sealing me in. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant croak of a frog. It took me a while to fall asleep, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest keeping me on edge. But eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The sun was already high when I emerged from the tent the next morning, the chill of the night giving way to a crisp, pleasant warmth. I boiled water for coffee and sat by the lake, savoring the tranquility. The reflections on the water were mesmerizing, and for a while I lost myself in the view. It wasn't until I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path behind me that I realized I wasn't alone. Turning, I saw a man approaching, his casual demeanor catching me off guard. He carried a small backpack and a walking stick, his clothes well worn but clean. He smiled as he came closer, raising a hand in greeting. "Good morning," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Beautiful spot, isn't it?" I nodded, caught off guard but trying to appear friendly. "Yeah, it's perfect. Didn't think I'd see anyone else out here." He chuckled. I thought the same thing. "Name's Mark. I'm set up just down the trail. Figured I'd stretch my legs and see who else was around." There was something disarming about his easy manner, and we exchanged small talk for a few minutes. He mentioned he'd been camping for years, said it was his way of disconnecting from the modern world. I found myself relaxing, reassured by his presence. It was nice to know someone else was nearby, even if I had come here to be alone. After a while, Mark excused himself, saying he had some fishing gear to set up by the lake. As he walked away, I felt a surprising sense of relief. His friendliness had been welcome, but solitude was what I had come here for. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was irrational, I told myself. Mark had been nothing but polite, and I had no reason to feel uneasy. Still, as I explored a new trail that afternoon, I kept glancing over my shoulder, the silence of the forest suddenly feeling oppressive. Returning to camp, I noticed something odd. A small rock formation near the edge of my site, a pile of stacked stones, had been disturbed. I didn't remember touching it, but I reasoned it must have been an animal. Shrugging it off, I prepared dinner, but my appetite had diminished. I ate quickly and retreated to my tent earlier than usual. That night, as the forest fell into its eerie quiet, I heard faint sounds, a twig snapping, the crunch of gravel. I lay still in my sleeping bag, my heart racing, straining to hear. The noises came and went, faint and irregular, until they finally stopped. I told myself it was just the forest's natural sounds, but I couldn't shake the image of Mark's face from my mind. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, my tent illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. The fire had long since died, and the forest was still, save for a faint rustling sound nearby. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, unmistakable and deliberate. My heart pounded as I sat up, the thin fabric of the tent feeling like no protection at all. The steps circled the campsite slowly, pausing occasionally as if the person Mark was listening for something. I held my breath, hoping whoever it was would leave. Minutes passed like hours before the sounds stopped completely. I waited, tense and unmoving, until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, there was no sign of anyone, but the unease had settled deep in my chest. Something wasn't right. By the time the sun was fully up, the tranquility of the previous days was gone, replaced by a gnawing tension I couldn't ignore. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but I hesitated. I told myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the better of me. Still, I decided to stay close to camp that day, avoiding the trails and keeping a sharp eye on my surroundings. Late that morning, as I sat by the lake trying to relax, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Turning, I saw Mark again, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He waved, a little too cheerfully, and approached without waiting for an invitation. "Morning," he said, his voice louder than necessary in the still air. "You sleep okay? Didn't hear any weird noises, did you?" The question caught me off guard. My unease deepened as I tried to gauge his expression. There was something off about his smile, something forced. I mumbled a vague reply, hoping to keep the conversation brief. Mark sat down on a nearby log, uncomfortably close to my chair. His questions quickly turned personal: where I lived, how long I planned to stay, whether anyone knew I was out here. Each query felt more invasive than the last, but I answered as vaguely as possible, careful not to reveal too much. His behavior grew stranger as the conversation dragged on. He laughed at odd moments, his eyes darting around the campsite as if searching for something. When I mentioned I had plans to hike later, he leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Be careful out there," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "You never know who you might run into." That was enough for me. I stood abruptly, making some excuse about needing to tend to my gear. Mark lingered for a few moments before finally walking away, but I could feel his eyes on me as he left. The moment he was out of sight, I began packing my things, deciding I couldn't stay another night. I worked quickly but carefully, stuffing my gear into my backpack while keeping an ear out for any sounds from the woods. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, but I didn't dare look around too much, fearing I might actually see something or someone. By early afternoon, I had everything packed. I debated leaving in the car, but worried Mark might be waiting near the parking area. Instead, I decided to take a trail that looped around the lake, planning to circle back to my car later when I felt it was safe. The forest was dense and eerily quiet as I walked, every crunch of leaves underfoot sounding deafening. I stopped frequently, listening for any sign of pursuit, but the woods remained silent. I began to think I had overreacted when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepped onto the trail behind me, Mark. He was too far away for me to see his expression, but the sight of him sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I picked up my pace, resisting the urge to run, hoping he wouldn't follow. But the sound of his footsteps quickened, closing the distance between us. Panic took over, and I broke into a sprint, dodging branches and roots as I veered off the trail. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my lungs burning with each breath. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting as much distance as possible between us. I didn't stop until I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the lake, my legs trembling from exertion. For a moment I thought I had lost him, but then I heard it, the faint sound of someone moving through the brush, deliberate and unrelenting. I crouched low, scanning the area for any way to defend myself. A loose rock caught my eye, its jagged edges sharp and unforgiving. Gripping it tightly, I pressed my back against the outcrop, waiting, my breathing shallow. Mark emerged from the trees moments later, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't shout, just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that froze me in place. When he finally moved, stepping toward me, I acted on pure instinct. I hurled the rock with all my strength, the impact sending him staggering backward. He lost his footing, tumbling into the underbrush. The sound of his fall echoed through the forest, followed by silence. I didn't wait to see if he was injured or unconscious. Grabbing my pack, I ran back toward the trail, my only thought to reach my car before he could recover. Every shadow seemed to shift as I sprinted, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my ears. When I finally reached the parking area, the sight of my car felt like salvation. I threw my gear into the back seat and started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life, breaking the suffocating silence. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, speeding down the dirt road without looking back. It had seemed like the right thing to do at the time. When the acquaintance, Evan, mentioned they were in a tight spot, I didn't hesitate to offer a temporary stay at my place. I wasn't particularly close to Evan. We'd met through a mutual friend at a gathering months earlier. Still, they'd always seemed polite, intelligent, and unassuming. When they explained their sudden housing predicament, their voice edged with quiet desperation. I couldn't ignore it. Just a week or two, they had assured me. I'll be out of your hair in no time. The arrangement started smoothly enough. Evan arrived with only a duffel bag and a laptop case, their minimalism adding to the impression that this was a short-term situation. I showed them to the spare room, and they immediately expressed gratitude, saying how much this meant to them. That first evening, we had a pleasant enough conversation over dinner. Evan shared vague details about their life, a string of unstable jobs, some strained family ties, and I listened, nodding at appropriate moments. It felt good to help someone. I told myself I was doing a kind thing, and for the first few days the arrangement felt almost effortless. Evan was quiet, respectful, and unobtrusive. They kept to themselves most of the time, occasionally emerging to share a meal or make small talk about the weather or a show they'd been watching. It was easy to forget they were even there. But as the days passed, something began to shift. It started with little things, the kind of details you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. A mug I'd left on the kitchen counter reappeared in the cupboard, cleaned and dry, though I hadn't touched it. A stack of unopened mail was moved from the entryway table to the shelf beside the door. These weren't unusual actions, and yet they felt oddly invasive, as if someone were quietly rearranging my life in the background. Evan began spending more and more time in their room, only emerging at odd hours. Late at night, I'd hear the soft creak of floorboards as they moved around the house, their shadow occasionally flickering past the gap beneath my bedroom door. When I mentioned it casually one morning, they offered a vague excuse about insomnia and a habit of pacing when they couldn't sleep. Then my belongings started to go missing, small, seemingly insignificant items. A pen from my desk, a book I'd left on the coffee table, a pair of socks fresh from the laundry. They would always turn up eventually, but in strange places. The pen in the kitchen drawer, the book under a chair in the living room, the socks folded neatly on the floor by the washing machine. Each time I'd shrug it off, telling myself it wasn't worth making a fuss. Evan had promised they'd be gone soon, and I didn't want to create unnecessary tension. But the unease was growing, a quiet hum at the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. A week turned into 10 days, and then 2 weeks. Evan didn't mention leaving, and I found myself hesitating to bring it up, unsure how to approach the subject without sounding ungrateful or impatient. They had started to assert a quiet but undeniable presence in the house, claiming shared spaces as if they had always belonged there. I came home one evening to find the living room rearranged. The armchair had been moved closer to the window, the coffee table shifted slightly to the side, a few books from my shelves had been stacked on the table, and an unfamiliar mug, Evan's, sat beside them. When I asked about it, they smiled faintly, brushing it off with a simple, "I thought it might feel cozier this way." It wasn't just the living room. The spare room had undergone a similar transformation. What had once been a tidy, impersonal space was now cluttered with Evan's belongings. Clothes spilled out of their duffel bag onto the floor, and the desk was covered with papers, notebooks, and what appeared to be hand-drawn diagrams. I didn't linger long enough to study them. When I mentioned their departure in passing, an awkward attempt to gauge their plans, they evaded the question with a non-committal response, something about waiting for a few things to fall into place. Their tone was polite, even friendly, but it carried an undercurrent of dismissal, as if they were gently but firmly closing the door on the conversation. The unease that had started as a quiet hum was now a persistent buzz. I knew I needed to confront Evan directly, but the thought of it made my stomach knot. I couldn't explain why, but the idea of making them angry, or even just uncomfortable, felt dangerous. It had seemed like the right thing to do at the time. When the acquaintance, Evan, mentioned they were in a tight spot, I didn't hesitate to offer a temporary stay at my place. I wasn't particularly close to Evan. We'd met through a mutual friend at a gathering months earlier. Still, they'd always seemed polite, intelligent, and unassuming. When they explained their sudden housing predicament, their voice edged with quiet desperation. I couldn't ignore it. "Just a week or two," they had assured me. "I'll be out of your hair in no time." The arrangement started smoothly enough. Evan arrived with only a duffel bag and a laptop case, their minimalism adding to the impression that this was a short-term situation. I showed them to the spare room, and they immediately expressed gratitude, saying how much this meant to them. That first evening, we had a pleasant enough conversation over dinner. Evan shared vague details about their life, a string of unstable jobs, some strained family ties, and I listened, nodding at appropriate moments. It felt good to help someone. I told myself I was doing a kind thing, and for the first few days, the arrangement felt almost effortless. Evan was quiet, respectful, and unobtrusive. They kept to themselves most of the time, occasionally emerging to share a meal or make small talk about the weather or a show they'd been watching. It was easy to forget they were even there. But as the days passed, something began to shift. It started with little things, the kind of details you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. A mug I'd left on the kitchen counter reappeared in the cupboard, cleaned and dry, though I hadn't touched it. A stack of unopened mail was moved from the entryway table to the shelf beside the door. These weren't unusual actions, and yet they felt oddly invasive, as if someone were quietly rearranging my life in the background. Evan began spending more and more time in their room, only emerging at odd hours. Late at night, I'd hear the soft creak of floorboards as they moved around the house, their shadow occasionally flickering past the gap beneath my bedroom door. When I mentioned it casually one morning, they offered a vague excuse about insomnia and a habit of pacing when they couldn't sleep. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled as if they had left in a hurry. The closet door was open, revealing nothing but an empty hanger swinging gently on its rail. A faint unease settled over me. I checked the rest of the house, but Evan was nowhere to be found. It was as though they had vanished overnight. Relief washed over me at first. They were gone, and the situation had resolved itself without further conflict. But the feeling was fleeting, replaced quickly by confusion and an inexplicable sense of dread. Why had they left so suddenly, and why hadn't they said anything? It was as if they'd disappeared without intending to leave a trace. Determined to restore some sense of normalcy, I began cleaning the guest room. As I gathered the scattered items, I noticed small, strange details. The diagrams, for instance, were more elaborate than I had initially thought. Some were annotated with cryptic phrases like convergence point and necessary alignment. Others were marked with dates, none of which meant anything to me. I also found objects I didn't recognize tucked into odd places. A silver coin hidden under the mattress, a small vial of an unidentifiable black powder stuffed behind a dresser, and a key I didn't recognize on the windowsill. None of it made sense, and the more I looked, the more I felt as though the room itself had taken on a different energy. It felt colder, heavier, as if Evan's presence had left a residue that clung stubbornly to the walls. One particularly unsettling discovery was a folded piece of paper taped beneath the desk. It was blank, save for a single word scrawled in the center: watching. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before tearing it down and stuffing it into the trash. The morning began like any other. My commute was a ritual by now, predictable, almost mechanical. I left my apartment just as the sun was cresting the skyline, casting long shadows across the streets. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of early activity, the sound of delivery trucks rumbling, distant conversations, and the occasional chirp of birds that hadn't yet fled the encroaching city noise. I took my usual route, a straightforward combination of streets and alleys that cut through the heart of downtown. The familiarity of it was comforting. I could time the journey almost to the second, knowing precisely when I'd pass the coffee shop with the too long line or the corner newsstand with its faded magazines. It was a routine I didn't think much about until that day. I first noticed them as I crossed a wide intersection. A group of 6 or 7 people stood on the opposite corner, clustered together in a way that seemed intentional. They wore identical clothing, plain dark shirts and pants, nothing flashy, but something about the uniformity struck me as odd. Their posture was rigid, their heads turning in perfect unison as they scanned the street. I tried not to stare as I passed them, but their presence lingered in my mind. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, not hurried, not idle, but synchronized, as if they were part of a choreographed routine. I brushed off the feeling, telling myself I was being ridiculous. People watching had always been a guilty habit of mine, and I figured they were just an unusually coordinated group. The rest of my walk to the subway station felt normal enough, though I couldn't shake the image of them standing there, silent and synchronized. When the train arrived, I boarded and found a seat near the window, settling into the usual rhythm of the ride. But as the train sped through the city's underground arteries, the faint unease remained, like an itch I couldn't quite reach. When I emerged from the subway, the city had shifted gears. The streets were busier now, alive with the chaos of mid-morning traffic and hurried pedestrians. I fell into step with the crowd, feeling the comforting anonymity of moving among strangers. But then I saw them again. The same group. Or at least, I was almost certain it was the same group, stood across the plaza ahead. They were arranged in a loose line this time, their identical clothing and synchronized movements unmistakable. One of them turned their head toward me, the motion eerily slow and deliberate, as if they'd been waiting for me to notice. My first instinct was to change direction, but I hesitated. What was I afraid of? They weren't doing anything, just standing there, silent, their expressions unreadable. I kept walking, avoiding eye contact as I passed. The crowd around me felt thinner now, the noise of the city fading into the background. I told myself again that I was overthinking it. Coincidences happened, especially in a city this size. But as I turned the corner, I glanced back. They had moved closer, still standing in perfect formation, their gazes fixed on me. The pit in my stomach deepened. I quickened my pace, trying to lose them in the throng of commuters. The next half hour passed in a blur of half-hearted errands. I visited a pharmacy and wandered aimlessly through a bookstore, trying to distract myself. Each time I stepped outside again, I scanned the streets, half expecting to see them. And every time, I spotted them, never far, always watching. They weren't hiding their presence anymore. I saw them standing at the end of a block, their heads tilted slightly, as if listening for something. When I crossed the street, they crossed too, maintaining a distance that was neither close enough to confront nor far enough to ignore. Their silence unnerved me most of all. They didn't speak, didn't shout or gesture. They simply moved as one, their eyes tracking my every step. The city's usual noise, the honking of horns, the snippets of conversation, faded into a dull hum, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I told myself I was imagining things. They couldn't really be following me. Maybe they just happened to be going the same way. But the unease was impossible to shake. My hands tightened around the straps of my bag as I walked faster, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. It was in the quiet corner of a park that they finally approached me. I had stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a bench and trying to steady my nerves. The open space seemed like a safe choice. Plenty of people nearby, plenty of exits. I didn't see them approach at first. When I looked up, they were there, standing in a semicircle just a few feet away. Their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then one of them, a tall man with an angular face, stepped forward, breaking the silence. "We've been waiting," he said. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You need to come with us." I didn't respond. My throat felt dry, my mind scrambling for a way out. The man tilted his head, as if puzzled by my hesitation. "You've already been chosen," he said. "You can't avoid it." The others nodded in unison, their expressions blank but somehow expectant. Their presence felt oppressive, like they were closing in without moving. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then the spell broke. I turned and bolted, weaving through the park's winding paths without looking back. Their footsteps echoed behind me, deliberate and synchronized. But I didn't stop. I didn't dare. The pounding of my feet against the pavement was matched only by the pounding of my heart. The park's winding path seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, the neatly trimmed hedges and scattered benches blurring together as I ran. Behind me, their footsteps remained steady, never hurried, never faltering, but always close enough to remind me they were there. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The group was still in formation, moving with an eerie synchronization that made my stomach twist. Their expressions were unreadable, their eyes fixed on me like predators closing in on their prey. The tall man who had spoken earlier was at the forefront, his long strides effortless as he led the pursuit. I darted down a side path that veered away from the main trail, hoping to lose them in the maze of trees and bushes. The path narrowed, its edges overgrown, and I realized too late that it was a dead end. The gate at the far end was locked, the rusted chain and padlock glinting in the faint light filtering through the branches. Panic surged through me as I turned back, my breath ragged. I could hear them approaching, their footsteps unnervingly even. There was no time to think. I ducked into the trees, the branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through the undergrowth. The park's manicured facade gave way to a wilder, untamed area, the neatly trimmed grass replaced by uneven dirt and tangled roots. I stumbled over a protruding root and fell hard, the impact jarring my bones. For a moment, I lay there, paralyzed by fear. Then I heard them again, closer now. The sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling sent me scrambling to my feet, my hands trembling as I clawed my way forward. The chase felt endless. Every time I thought I had gained some distance, their presence loomed again, unrelenting. The forest seemed to conspire against me, its shadows deepening as the sky above turned overcast. My legs burned with exertion, but I didn't stop. Stopping wasn't an option. When I finally emerged from the trees, I found myself on the edge of a busy street. Cars whizzed by, their headlights piercing the gloom, and the sidewalk bustled with pedestrians. The sight of so many people was like a lifeline. I sprinted across the street, ignoring the honking horns and angry shouts, and plunged into the crowd. The group didn't follow immediately. They emerged from the park's edge, their dark clothing stark against the vibrant cityscape, and stood there watching. Their stillness was unnerving, their synchronized movements momentarily halted as if they were waiting for something. I ducked into a convenience store, hoping the glass door and fluorescent lights would offer some semblance of safety. The clerk glanced at me but said nothing as I lingered near the back, pretending to browse the shelves. I kept one eye on the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The group didn't enter. Instead, they stood outside, their heads turning in unison as they scanned the street. It was as though they were calculating their next move, their eerie calm contrasting sharply with my rising panic. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Gathering my courage, I slipped out through a side entrance and took off down a narrow alley. The city's labyrinthine streets became my refuge, each twist and turn a desperate attempt to throw them off my trail. The noise of the city was both a blessing and a curse, masking their presence, but also disorienting me. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I needed to keep moving. It wasn't until I reached a dilapidated pedestrian underpass that I realized the footsteps had stopped. The tunnel's dim lighting and graffiti-covered walls felt foreboding, but I couldn't hear them anymore. I slowed to a walk, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I strained to listen. Nothing. No synchronized footsteps, no rustling in the shadows, just the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from the tunnel's ceiling. I leaned against the cold concrete wall, my legs trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Had I lost them? The thought felt fragile, like it would shatter if I held onto it too tightly. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting to every shadow, my ears straining for any sound. But the group didn't appear. They were gone. My house was a modest, weathered structure perched on the edge of a vast stretch of woods. It was the kind of place people described as peaceful, removed from the constant hum of city life. I had moved there for exactly that reason. Quiet mornings with birdsong, evenings wrapped in the soft glow of the setting sun, and the comforting solitude that came with living on the edge of nowhere. For months, it was everything I had hoped for. The woods were my backyard, their towering trees a protective curtain against the world. But then the lights began. The first time I noticed them, I had just settled into my armchair by the window, the kind of spot that made you feel cocooned from the outside. Through the glass, I caught a faint glimmer in the distance, flashing in rhythmic bursts, short, long, short. It was too steady to be a reflection or a random flicker. It almost seemed deliberate. I brushed it off as someone camping or a group of kids playing with flashlights. The forest was public land after all, and I had seen hikers and nature enthusiasts wandering through from time to time. But the lights returned the next night, and the night after that, always the same rhythmic patterns, the same spot deep within the trees. By the fourth night, curiosity outweighed the comfort of my chair. I stood at the window, watching intently as the flashes continued. Something about their precision unsettled me. This wasn't just aimless fun. There was a purpose to it, though I couldn't fathom what it might be. The fifth night was when I decided to investigate. It was a rash decision, made in the heat of curiosity and a twinge of frustration. My flashlight felt heavy in my hand as I stepped onto the back porch. The air was cold and still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. The crunch of my boots on dry leaves, the snap of a distant branch. The lights were already flashing when I entered the woods, faint pulses drawing me deeper. My breath hung in the air, visible in the beam of the flashlight as I moved carefully between the trees. The forest at night was a different world, its shadows long and its noises sharper. I tried to stay quiet, though the occasional misstep sent twigs cracking underfoot. As I approached the spot where the lights seemed to originate, I expected to find something, anything, that might explain them. But when I reached a small clearing, it was empty. The lights were gone. The sudden absence was almost more unnerving than their presence. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the area with my flashlight, but the only movement came from the swaying branches above. I returned home feeling more unsettled than before. Had I imagined it? Was someone watching me from deeper in the woods, waiting for me to leave? The questions circled my mind as I locked the doors and sat in the darkened living room, staring out at the trees. The lights didn't reappear that night, but their absence felt temporary, like they were waiting for me to let my guard down. The next night, I hesitated at the window, torn between staying safely indoors and giving in to the gnawing curiosity that had been building since the first time I saw the lights. When they started flashing again, short bursts, long pauses, a rhythm too deliberate to ignore, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside before I could talk myself out of it. This time, I moved quickly, following the flashes deeper into the woods than I had dared to go before. The trees seemed to close in around me, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The flashes grew brighter as I approached, until finally I saw them. A clearing opened ahead, and in it were figures, 5 or 6, maybe more, moving with quiet precision. They carried small flashlights, the beams flicking on and off in synchronized patterns. At first, I thought they were campers, but something about their movements and the way they stayed so silent made me stop short and crouch behind a tree. I watched as the lights danced in deliberate sequences, signaling toward another group further down the clearing. The realization hit me slowly, a cold dread seeping into my chest. This wasn't camping or stargazing. This was a meeting, a covert operation. Smuggling? Illegal trade? I couldn't be sure, but the tension in the air was palpable, even from my hiding spot. As I crouched there, heart hammering in my chest, one of the figures turned suddenly. Their flashlight swept across the trees, its beams slicing through the darkness with chilling precision. I froze, pressing myself against the rough bark, hoping the shadows would conceal me. The beam passed over me but didn't stop, and I let out a silent breath. Then, I stepped on a branch. The crack echoed in the stillness like a gunshot. Every flashlight in the clearing snapped toward the source of the sound, toward me. I didn't wait to see their faces or hear what they might say. I turned and ran, the forest a blur around me as I sprinted back the way I had come. Behind me, shouts erupted, low and urgent, followed by the rapid crunch of footsteps. They were following me. The forest seemed to come alive with sound as I ran. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the snapping of branches, and my own ragged breaths mixed with the urgent voices of my pursuers. Flashlights flickered erratically behind me, their beams slicing through the darkness and casting long, shifting shadows. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burn in my legs and the ache in my chest. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the people behind me. Their voices were low but carried a chilling intensity, their words indistinct but unmistakably hostile. They were calling out to each other, coordinating their search. The trees felt closer than before, their branches snagging at my jacket like claws. The forest, which I had once considered a haven, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me. I stumbled over an exposed root, catching myself just in time to avoid falling, but the brief misstep cost me precious seconds. The voices grew louder, the flashlights closer. I veered sharply to the left, leaving the faint path I had been following and plunging into the denser undergrowth. The decision was risky. I knew the woods well, but at night, even familiar landmarks could become disorienting. Still, I hoped the thick brush would slow my pursuers enough to give me a chance to escape. The sound of their pursuit continued, relentless. I didn't dare look back. My flashlight had long since been turned off, its beam too much of a giveaway. Instead, I relied on the faint silver glow of the moon filtering through the canopy above, guiding me toward what I hoped was safety. After what felt like an eternity of running, I spotted a familiar landmark, a cluster of boulders near the edge of the woods. Relief flooded through me as I realized I was close to home. But the feeling was short-lived. A flashlight beam swept across the ground just ahead of me, and I realized one of them had looped around, cutting off my escape. I froze, crouching low behind a fallen log as the light passed inches from my hiding spot. My heart pounded in my ears, so loud I was certain they could hear it. The figure holding the flashlight stood motionless for a moment, scanning the area. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. Finally, they moved on, the beam of their flashlight bobbing away as they continued their search. I waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before moving again, my movements slow and deliberate. The boulders were just ahead, and beyond them lay the clearing that led to my property. I crawled on hands and knees, every muscle tensed, until I reached the edge of the woods. When I finally broke free of the trees, my house came into view, a shadowy silhouette against the faint glow of the horizon. I sprinted the final stretch, my legs screaming in protest, and threw myself against the back door. My hands fumbled with the keys, the fear of being caught making them clumsy. When the lock finally clicked open, I slipped inside and bolted the door behind me. For several minutes, I stood there in the dark, my back pressed against the door, listening for any signs of pursuit. The woods outside were silent, but the oppressive weight of the experience lingered. Slowly, I moved through the house, double-checking every lock and closing every curtain. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. It started as an unremarkable day, the kind of day where the world seems to glide by without incident, just a background hum of casual errands and minor tasks. I had planned to walk a few blocks to a bookstore, maybe grab coffee at a corner shop I liked. The air was brisk, but not cold, the sort of crispness that feels invigorating rather than oppressive. The streets were moderately busy, with the usual mix of pedestrians and the occasional cyclist zipping past. Cars rolled lazily down the avenues, their tires hissing over damp pavement. A few scattered clouds moved sluggishly across the sky, casting fleeting shadows on the storefronts. I enjoyed the relative calm, walking at a leisurely pace, my thoughts drifting. The buzz of the city, usually overwhelming, felt oddly distant that day. Even the occasional street performer or vendor seemed less intrusive, blending into the scenery. For once, I wasn't rushing anywhere, and I allowed myself to savor that rare luxury of time. It was during this quiet moment, as I strolled past a small park, that I saw them. A group of about 5 people stood clustered near the sidewalk, their brightly colored banners and signs impossible to miss. They wore matching t-shirts with a logo I didn't recognize, and their smiles seemed fixed, almost rehearsed. A folding table beside them was stacked with flyers, donation jars, and clipboards. I thought nothing of it, assuming they were promoting a harmless cause, like countless others I'd seen. I adjusted my bag and kept walking, planning to pass them without a second glance. But as I approached, one of them stepped forward, directly into my path. Their smile widened unnaturally as they greeted me. "Hi there, do you have a moment to hear about something really important?" Caught off guard, I paused. Politeness had always been my Achilles heel, and I couldn't bring myself to brush them off outright. The person who had stopped me, a woman probably in her late 20s, held out a clipboard and gestured toward their table. "We're raising awareness for a critical cause," she said, her voice bright and practiced. "Would you be willing to spare just a few minutes to learn how you can make a difference?" Behind her, the others watched intently, their smiles unwavering. It felt like stepping onto a stage without knowing my lines. I nodded hesitantly, hoping to make a quick exit once I'd listened to their pitch. She launched into a polished speech about their organization, something about community outreach and helping underserved populations. At first, it sounded legitimate, even admirable. I found myself nodding along, though I wasn't entirely sure what they were asking for. She spoke quickly, almost too quickly, as if rehearsing a script. I glanced at the others. They were still watching, their expressions eerily similar to hers. "Here's how you can help," she said, flipping a page on the clipboard. "We're asking for small, recurring donations. Just $20 a month can change lives." I shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, I don't think I can commit to anything like that right now." Her smile didn't falter, but her tone sharpened slightly. "It's really not much when you think about it. Most people spend more than that on coffee in a week." The others began to close in subtly, creating a loose semicircle around me. Their presence felt suffocating, and my initial unease deepened. I tried to excuse myself, mumbling something about being in a hurry, but the woman persisted, her questions growing more pointed. "Where are you headed? Can't you spare just a little time to help those in need?" Her words felt less like an invitation and more like a challenge. I apologized again and finally broke away, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't fully explain. As I walked briskly down the street, I resisted the urge to look back. The next few blocks felt unnaturally long. My thoughts raced as I tried to shake the encounter from my mind. It was common to run into groups like that in the city, I told myself. They were just overly persistent, nothing more. But something about their demeanor, the way they had surrounded me, lingered in my mind. I stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, and glanced over my shoulder. They were still there, clustered around their table, but 2 of them stood apart, watching me. One of them, a man with a sharp jawline and a clipboard under his arm, caught my eye. He didn't look away. I crossed the street quickly, my pace increasing as I turned the corner. The city felt less welcoming now, its streets narrower and its shadows deeper. I ducked into a bookstore, lingering among the shelves longer than I needed to. When I finally stepped outside again, I felt momentarily relieved. That relief evaporated when I spotted them at the end of the block. They weren't clustered around their table anymore. They were standing together, just watching. I told myself it was a coincidence. The city wasn't exactly small. It wasn't unusual to run into the same people twice. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less I believed it. Their presence felt deliberate, calculated. They weren't handing out flyers or stopping other pedestrians. They were just there. I crossed to the opposite side of the street, keeping my head down as I walked. A quick glance behind me confirmed my worst fear. They were following. Not all of them, just 2, the man and the woman who had spoken to me earlier. They kept their distance, but their movements were unmistakable. Panic began to creep in, tightening my chest and quickening my steps. I turned into an alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of back streets, but their footsteps echoed behind me. I darted into another street, weaving through pedestrians, my mind racing for a plan. The city's usual noise, the honking of horns, the chatter of strangers, blurred into the background as my focus narrowed to one thing: escape. The bustling streets seemed both a blessing and a curse as I pressed forward, weaving through the crowd. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, hoping to see an empty sidewalk where the two strangers had been. But they were still there, just far enough behind to avoid causing a scene, but close enough to keep me within their line of sight. I tried to think rationally, but every option felt flawed. Running would draw attention, but staying calm wasn't working either. They weren't losing interest. I cut sharply down another side street, heading toward a part of the city I wasn't familiar with. The buildings here were older, the sidewalks narrower, and the crowd thinner. For a moment, I thought I had finally shaken them. That moment didn't last long. As I reached a deserted stretch of road, I heard their footsteps again. Turning, I saw them emerge from the corner I'd just passed, their pace quickening now, their expressions no longer neutral. The man carried his clipboard like a weapon, his knuckles pale against its edges. The woman's earlier cheerfulness had evaporated, replaced by a cold determination. I broke into a jog, my heart racing as I scanned the street for anywhere to hide. A convenience store loomed ahead, but it looked nearly empty inside, its dim lighting offering little comfort. I kept moving, my breaths coming faster now, my legs burning with every step. The sounds of their pursuit grew louder, closer. They weren't shouting or calling after me, that would draw attention. But their silence was somehow worse. It felt predatory, like they wanted me to know they were there, to feel their presence closing in. I ducked into an alley, hoping it would lead me to a busier street, but it ended in a locked gate. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back the way I came. They were there, standing at the alley's entrance. The man took a step forward, his shadow stretching toward me as the woman stayed behind, her face partially obscured by the shadows of the buildings. "You didn't have to make this difficult," the man said, his voice flat. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The words carried a quiet menace that froze me in place. I didn't respond. Instead, I bolted past them, my shoulder brushing against the woman's as I sprinted back onto the main street. She shouted something, angry, incomprehensible, but I didn't stop to listen. My only thought was to reach somewhere crowded, somewhere safe. The sight of a cafeteria, brightly lit and packed with people, was like a beacon. I pushed through the glass door, the warm air inside washing over me as the chatter of customers replaced the eerie silence of the pursuit. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the room for a seat near the back, somewhere I could blend in. I found a small table near the counter and sank into the chair, my back to the wall. From here, I could see the entrance and the large windows overlooking the street. The group hadn't followed me inside, not yet. But as I watched, the man and woman appeared on the sidewalk, their faces lit by the neon glow of the cafeteria's sign. They stopped just outside, their heads turning as they scanned the room. I slouched lower in my seat, gripping the edge of the table as I tried to steady my breathing. The cafeteria felt safe, its bustling energy a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere outside. Waitstaff moved efficiently between tables, their trays piled high with steaming plates and cups of coffee. A few customers glanced at me, their curiosity fleeting before they returned to their meals. The man and woman lingered outside for what felt like an eternity, their silhouettes framed by the cafeteria's bright windows. I could see them talking, their heads close together as they gestured toward the door. A few times, the man stepped forward as if he were about to come inside, but he always stopped, glancing around as if weighing his options. Finally, they seemed to reach a decision. The woman turned sharply, walking away down the street without a backward glance. The man hesitated, his gaze lingering on the door before he followed her. I didn't relax until they disappeared from view entirely. When I moved into the neighborhood, I expected to feel isolated for a while. It was a quiet area, rows of tidy houses with neatly trimmed lawns, the kind of place where everyone seemed to have known each other for years. I had traded the chaos of city living for a chance to reset, to find some peace. But peace, I quickly realized, had its drawbacks. The silence was heavier than I anticipated, and the absence of familiar faces made the days feel long. Then I met them, the circle. It started innocently enough. I was coming back from a walk when a woman named Linda waved at me from her porch. She had a warm smile, the kind that made it impossible not to stop and chat. Within minutes, she introduced herself as one of the organizers of the neighborhood's social club and invited me to a gathering that weekend. "You'll love it," she said. "It's just a chance for everyone to relax and get to know each other. Bring whatever you'd like to drink." I hesitated for a moment, unused to such open friendliness, but her enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time I walked away, I had promised to attend. The gathering that Saturday was everything Linda had described: friendly, light-hearted, and welcoming. The group was a mix of ages and backgrounds, united by an easy camaraderie that made me feel at home almost instantly. They asked about my work, my hobbies, and how I was settling in. Everyone seemed genuinely interested, their laughter and banter creating an atmosphere I hadn't realized I missed. By the end of the night, I was already looking forward to the next one. Over the following weeks, I became a regular at their gatherings. They were casual affairs, barbecues, movie nights, and occasional potlucks, each one as warm and inviting as the last. The group had a way of making you feel like you belonged, like you were part of something bigger than yourself. I started to learn their names and little details about their lives. Linda, of course, was the unofficial leader, her sharp wit and boundless energy making her the center of every conversation. There was Tom, who loved to talk about his latest woodworking projects, and Emma, whose dry humor kept everyone laughing. Each member brought something unique to the dynamic, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. Occasionally, I noticed odd quirks in the group's behavior. They had phrases they used often, things like "we rise together" or "a strong foundation builds a strong community." At first, I thought it was just their way of reinforcing the neighborhood's tight-knit spirit. It was charming, even comforting. During one gathering, Linda asked if I could help set up for the next event, a small favor that seemed natural given how welcoming they'd been to me. I agreed without hesitation, eager to contribute. That day, as I helped string lights across Linda's backyard, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't long before I began noticing the unspoken rules that governed the circle. Participation was never explicitly required, but there was an undeniable expectation that everyone would show up to gatherings and pitch in when needed. Missing an event or declining an invitation was met with polite but persistent questions. "Everything okay? We missed you last time." The group had a way of steering conversations in a particular direction, subtly discouraging anything that didn't align with their shared values. Jokes that strayed too far from their humor fell flat, and attempts to introduce new ideas or activities were gently but firmly redirected. It was never overt, but it left me with the distinct feeling that stepping out of line would be noticed. At one gathering, Linda casually mentioned a new tradition they were starting, a weekly discussion night where everyone would share something personal, a challenge, or a moment of growth. It sounded harmless, even uplifting, but when my turn came, the attention felt suffocating. Their eyes were warm but expectant, and the silence that followed my story was filled with an unspoken demand for more. Later, as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had shared too much, that my words had been sifted and weighed in a way I didn't fully understand. The gatherings began to take on a different tone. What had once been casual and carefree now carried an undercurrent of formality. The discussion nights became a regular feature, and the group's encouragement to open up grew more insistent. It wasn't enough to share surface-level thoughts. They wanted depth, vulnerability. At times, it felt less like camaraderie and more like an interrogation. One evening, they introduced a new ritual. Linda called it strengthening the bond. It involved standing in a circle, holding hands, and repeating a series of phrases about trust and unity. I went along with it, feeling silly but unwilling to stand out. Everyone else seemed so sincere, their voices steady as they spoke in unison. But as the ritual continued, a strange tension filled the air. The phrases became more personal. "We trust each other to rise above," and "our strength is in our unity." The words felt heavier, as though they carried an unspoken weight. I caught a glance from Tom, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. When it was over, everyone seemed lighter, as though the ritual had energized them. But I felt drained, uneasy. For the first time since joining the circle, I questioned what I had gotten myself into. The warmth that had once defined the group began to feel like a facade. What had started as gentle encouragement to participate turned into an unspoken rule. Compliance was expected. Skipping a gathering or failing to engage in a ritual wasn't just noticed. It was addressed, subtly at first, and then with a quiet intensity that felt impossible to ignore. One evening, after I declined an invitation to help prepare for an upcoming event, Linda stopped by my house unannounced. She stood on my porch, her smile disarming but her tone laced with quiet reprimand. "We missed you at the meeting last night," she said, as though my absence had disrupted something far more important than a simple gathering. "You're part of this, you know. We need everyone to pull their weight." I nodded, offering vague excuses about being tired, but her eyes never left mine. She stayed for far longer than felt appropriate, her questions circling back to the same point. Why hadn't I been there, and when would I make it up to them? At the next gathering, the tension was palpable. The group's usual laughter and camaraderie felt rehearsed, their smiles too sharp, their gazes lingering just a little too long. During the ritual that night, Linda added a new element. Each member was asked to confess a time they had let the group down and pledged to do better. When my turn came, I stumbled through a half-hearted apology for my absence, but the silence that followed made it clear they weren't satisfied. "You can do better," Linda said, her voice gentle but firm. "We all can." I nodded, the words feeling less like encouragement and more like a warning. The pressure continued to mount, and the group's expectations grew more invasive. Linda began calling me almost daily, her tone cheerful but her questions pointed. She wanted to know where I was, what I was doing, and whether I'd be attending the next gathering. If I hesitated, she'd remind me of the importance of commitment, of how much the group depended on me. One night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The rituals, the constant scrutiny, the way they seemed to strip away my independence, it was too much. I skipped a gathering without explanation, ignoring the messages and calls that began flooding my phone almost immediately. The next day, Linda showed up at my door again. This time, she wasn't alone. Tom and Emma flanked her, their expressions carefully neutral, but their presence unmistakably intimidating. Linda didn't ask why I had missed the gathering. She simply said, "We need to talk." The conversation was brief, but unsettling. They emphasized how much the group valued me, how important my participation was to their success. When I tried to explain that I needed some space, their smiles faded. Linda's voice dropped to a near whisper as she said, "We're all in this together. You don't walk away from something this important." After they left, I locked every door and window in the house, my hands shaking. I knew then that I had to sever ties completely. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. It was the kind of night where the world seemed to fold in on itself, the sky heavy with clouds that swallowed the stars. My headlights pierced the gloom, illuminating the occasional road sign and the reflective eyes of animals lurking at the forest's edge. I had always found late-night drives calming, a time to let my thoughts drift and enjoy the solitude. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive, the emptiness of the road unsettling rather than serene. The hum of the tires on the pavement was the only sound, a monotonous reminder of how far I was from the nearest town. As I rounded a bend, my high beams caught something up ahead. A car parked awkwardly on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing. Standing beside it was a figure, their arm raised in a tentative wave. I slowed instinctively, my initial hesitation quickly overshadowed by a pang of compassion. It wasn't safe to be stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. Pulling over a few feet ahead of the car, I rolled down the passenger side window. The figure approached cautiously, their face illuminated briefly in the headlights. They looked to be in their late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a heavy coat that seemed out of place for the mild night. "Need some help?" I asked, my voice cutting through the stillness. They nodded, their expression one of weary gratitude. Yeah, my car died and my phone's out of battery. I just need a ride to the next town. I hesitated, the logical part of my brain screaming at me to say no, to drive away. But the look on their face was hard to ignore. After a brief internal debate, I unlocked the door and gestured for them to get in. The stranger slid into the passenger seat, pulling the door shut with a soft thud. The air inside the car seemed to shift immediately, the presence of another person breaking the fragile cocoon of solitude I had wrapped myself in. Thanks, they said, buckling their seatbelt. I really appreciate it. I've been out here for over an hour. No problem, I replied, glancing over at them. Up close, they looked tired but otherwise ordinary. Brown hair, pale skin, and a faint shadow of stubble on their jaw. Their coat was frayed at the edges, and their hands fidgeted slightly as they adjusted the cuffs. Where are you headed? Just the next town, if that's okay, they said, their voice calm and polite. There's a gas station there. I can call someone from the payphone. I nodded and merged back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness once more. The first few minutes of the drive were quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. Eventually, the stranger broke the silence. Late night for you too, huh? They asked, their tone casual. Yeah, I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. Just heading home. They nodded, their gaze fixed out the window. You're a good person for stopping. Most people wouldn't have. It's no trouble, I said, though the knot in my stomach was beginning to suggest otherwise. The initial awkwardness of having a stranger in my car began to give way to something more disquieting. The conversation, which had started with polite small talk, took on an odd, probing quality. They asked questions that felt a little too personal. Where I lived, whether I often drove this route, if anyone was waiting for me at home. I answered vaguely, trying to steer the conversation back to neutral ground, but their persistence was unsettling. They had a way of framing their questions that made declining to answer feel rude, almost defensive. And when I didn't respond immediately, they would smile faintly, as though amused by my discomfort. The stranger's body language had changed too. They sat slightly angled toward me, their hands resting on their knees, fingers tapping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Their eyes, which had initially seemed weary, now carried an intensity that made my skin crawl. I glanced at the dashboard clock. The next town wasn't far, 10 minutes at most. But the seconds stretched unbearably, each one marked by the thudding of my heart in my chest. You know, they said suddenly, their voice lower now, almost conspiratorial, not everyone would stop for someone like me. What do you mean? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. They shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of their mouth. People see someone on the side of the road at night, and they assume the worst. Like maybe I'm dangerous. I didn't respond, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the faint glow of distant streetlights teasing me with the promise of safety. The tension in the car grew thick, suffocating. The stranger's tone shifted further, their polite demeanor slipping away to reveal something darker. They leaned back in their seat, one arm resting casually on the door, but their gaze was anything but relaxed. Funny, isn't it? They said, their words dripping with mockery. How quick people are to trust a stranger. I forced a laugh, hoping to diffuse the situation. I guess I'm just an optimist. They tilted their head, studying me with a look that sent a chill down my spine. Or maybe you're just naive. I didn't reply, my mind racing with ways to end this interaction as quickly as possible. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car, a potential ally, but the road behind us was empty. The stranger leaned forward slightly, their voice dropping to a near whisper. What would you do if I wasn't who I said I was? The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and threatening. My grip on the wheel tightened, my knuckles white. We're almost there, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. You'll be able to call for help soon. Their smile widened, but it didn't reach their eyes. Sure, they said, soon. In the distance I saw it, a glowing hotel sign cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Relief flooded through me, though I fought to keep my expression neutral. I just needed to make it there. The glowing hotel sign ahead felt like salvation. Its neon letters buzzed faintly in the distance, illuminating the parking lot with a pale, flickering light. I gripped the wheel tightly, forcing myself to appear calm as I gestured toward it. "I need to stop here for a moment," I said, my voice carefully measured. "Forgot to use the restroom before I left." The stranger didn't respond immediately. Their eyes followed the direction of my gesture, narrowing slightly as they studied the building. For a moment, I thought they might protest, but then they leaned back in their seat, their body language strangely relaxed. "Sure," they said, the word carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. I pulled into the parking lot slowly, my mind racing through possible ways to get them out of the car. I parked near the entrance, the fluorescent lights above the doorway casting harsh shadows across the asphalt. Forcing a smile, I turned to them. "It won't take long. You're welcome to stretch your legs while I'm inside." They studied me for a moment, their expression unreadable. Then, without a word, they unbuckled their seatbelt and opened the door. I waited until they stepped out, watching as they closed the door behind them and took a few steps toward the hotel entrance. The moment the door shut, I threw the car into reverse, my heart pounding as I backed out of the space and sped toward the exit. I didn't look at the stranger as I drove away, but I felt their gaze like a weight on the back of my neck. As I merged back onto the highway, my hands trembled on the wheel. The car's interior, which had felt suffocating moments ago, now seemed too large, too empty. My rearview mirror offered no signs of pursuit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. My mind replayed the encounter in fragments. The stranger's invasive questions, their unsettling remarks, the way their demeanor had shifted so abruptly. Every detail felt like a warning I should have heeded earlier. I berated myself for stopping in the first place, for letting compassion override common sense. The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and endless. My only goal was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that hotel. I didn't even know if they had done anything truly wrong, but the unease they had left behind was impossible to ignore. By the time I reached a familiar stretch of road near my home, the tension in my chest had eased slightly. The safety of my neighborhood, with its quiet streets and glowing porch lights, felt like a protective barrier. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a moment, the engine idling as I tried to collect my thoughts.